Hello, everyone. It's Professor Hall, and we are exploring again leaders of the Harlem Renaissance, this time looking at William Johnson, who was an artist during that time. So let's get started. I love that picture. Looks like he's about to sail a ship. I don't know quite what he's doing there. Born in South Carolina to poor African American family, Johnson moved to New York at the age of 17. Working a variety of jobs, he saved enough money to pay for an art education at the prestigious National Academy of Design, where he won multiple awards for his work as a student. This is kind of a common thing. We have a lot of people coming from during that Great Migration that we've talked about, coming from the South in kind of impoverished circumstances and finding a new life for themselves in Harlem and making a way where they might not have had that opportunity elsewhere, and really contributing to American culture at that time in art and music and literature, of course, as we're reading, right? He worked for a time in France and then married a Danish artist. They lived in Scandinavia, and I wish that I had put some pictures, now I'm thinking of it, of Scandinavian art in here, because Scandinavian art and design is quite simplistic, right? So he was really inspired by the folk art of that country. He came back to Harlem to teach and paint toward the end of the Harlem Renaissance and stayed there throughout the 1930s and 40s. His art was primarily done in a folk art style, which we've seen a couple artists do that as well, depicting people in both rural and urban settings, of course, influenced by different parts of his life, right? Being in South Carolina and also being in New York City. So I included later a couple pictures of some of his early work before Scandinavia, because I think you can see more of an impressionistic style, and then some of his work that he's better known for, which of course is in that really simple, bright colored folk art style that we've seen a couple artists do in our series here. Like this picture right here. This is, of course, during World War II. We've got some sailors on leave at a dance hall, dancing and eating and drinking at a restaurant here. So one critic says Johnson immersed himself in the traditions of Afro-America, producing work characterized by its stunning, eloquent folk art simplicity. He was a well-established artist, but his studio burned in 1942 and he lost a lot of his work. Around the same time, his wife was ill. She died in 1944 and his mental health declined. And sadly, he spent the last 23 years of his life in a state hospital where eventually he passed away. The remaining work that was not burned in the fire was going to be destroyed because he couldn't pay for the storage fees. Thankfully, a few of his friends were able to find out about this and they rescued his art at the last minute. They paid the storage fees and they saved the artwork. And now over 1,000 of his paintings are part of the Smithsonian Institute's Smithsonian American Art Museum and collection. And thankfully, we have enough of his work. I can't imagine how much was lost in the fire if we still have over 1,000 paintings in the Smithsonian, or at least owned by them. And sometimes, sometimes they'll exhibit there and sometimes they'll have special exhibits and traveling exhibits and things like this. But this Scandinavian style with these like thin lines and really flat, simple kind of things where it's, foreground and background, but there aren't, there is not a lot of like depth and curve and shadow in terms of that. We get a little bit here with her dress, but that's not how the movement is created, right? It's created with like these loose, long limbs. So here's some of his earlier work. We have a young chef here. You can see the impressionistic lines if you've looked at something like Monet or Manet, all of that early work. A little bit, I think, of Cezanne influence here too, with the way that the brush strokes are done and that to give here, we have that depth, right? We see the shadow along the face, creating that more three-dimensional kind of thing. We have various colors making up this person's face to show where the cheeks are, right, where the bridge of the nose is, where the eyebrows are, the forehead, all of that. Same thing with the coat, right? The various lights and darks that you would see looking at someone, where the shadows lie and all of that. And this is a street scene. If I can zoom in here, this I think might be watercolor, though he's not really known for that. So there's one figure and really interesting shapes here to kind of give you the feeling of being in this on this street or in this alleyway with the sky above. This work, though, oh, here's one more. Again, impressionistic scene. You can think of something like Degas, right? And Starry Night. It's kind of looks like it's inspired by that. The quick brush strokes here, creating the sky and the way that the sun radiates out and the variations in color. It's really masterfully done with all of these boats. And, if you zoom in really tight, you can't really quite maybe make out what it is, right? But it's when you zoom out that you can get the impression of the entire scene. And that's really what it's meant to do. Impressionism came about in part because of photography. Many artists before that point were trying to kind of depict things in a very realistic or hyper-realistic way. And when photographs came out, some artists were rebelling against that technology and just sort of saying, like, let's focus on how things make people feel rather than how they exactly look. What's our impression of how they look, and what does that impression make us feel? Modern art takes that even further and gets into more sometimes abstract shapes. And you think about things like Picasso and Cubism and things like that. And then we get into Dadaism and all of that. But here, oops, click more. There we go. So let's see Johnson's folk art. This is, I think this is called the Jitterbug. I love it. With the drum and the horns and the man and the woman dancing. But totally different in style, right? We don't have that same variation in color, and we don't have the same depth. This is much more Scandinavian in style, and really you can see how the movement here is created by the way that the shapes are placed, right? But you get really a sense of them having quite a good time dancing, right? She's throwing her arm up here above her head, and he's shaking his hand and waving while he's kind of tossing her around the dance floor. A later work, a little bit later, that depicting the some riots that took place in Harlem, and the scene and what he saw there. So we see the broken bottles and people bleeding. This woman being, carried out by various people by her arms and her legs, and this man not knowing what to do, and this person also being taken away. But it's interesting to me the way that this is layered as well. The only red is from the blood, the really kind of true red. We get brown with the bottles and that kind of thing. And the only pattern is on her dress and on their belts. So their belts having a little bit of a crisscross pattern, right? And her dress having the flowers on it. So it really brings your attention there. That bright yellow in the middle, and the yellow here and the yellow of the sun. We have a little bit down here as well, but the bright yellow and the pattern in the middle draw your eye to the center of the painting, and the Harlem itself becomes more of a backdrop, which I think is kind of an interesting way to depict it, rather than you think about the other city scene I showed you that he painted, where the buildings really are kind of more prominent. Here we're in the middle of the street, and the rest of the town fades away because of the horrors of what is happening here. One more. And here is some rural I wanted to show you guys this as well. An interesting way here, we don't have pattern on clothing, but we do kind of have a pattern in on the various places. Some stripes here to show the rows of, I'm guessing maybe corn or wheat, and also on the house, and then the furrows here that they're plowing. So the man, the woman, and then the donkey or the horse that they're using to pull the little plow here. But again, really bright colors, and you can see here a little bit of a difference from the city scene that we saw before, and using color to depict rural life as opposed to back here the more somber tones of the city, and then here the much brighter and more vibrant tones of a more fun, exciting scene, right? Here we get the yellow and the blues and the reds, and then a gray sky. And it looks maybe even like a moon, like maybe they're doing this kind of at twilight, that they're still working, right? Showing some of the scenes he might have grown up with and seen in South Carolina when he was young. So I hope that you enjoyed this. And I hope that you learned a little bit about William Johnson and his influence on the art scene at the time. Even though he had a more tragic later life, he really did affect a lot of other artists and their work, especially people who were working in this folk art medium at the time. And thankfully, we still have some of his paintings with us today. So that's it. I will see you all next week. Thanks.